We are gonna go through, so this is part 2 of the REPC class. So Jason, and really technically this is part 1, Jason did part 2. We kind of got them out of order, but can't remember why we did, but we had some reason we had to get them out of order. So anyway, what we're gonna do, so hopefully what happened with you guys on Tuesday was that Jason went through and did it as kind of a workshop. So the idea of that one was more of, hey, let's go through and talk about the how to fill it out. Today is gonna be more about like what the sections mean and those type of things. So for you guys on Zoom, reminder to throw your name in the chat box if you haven't yet. And I don't think there is anything in there. So, and then for everybody else on Zoom as well, the other thing is you have to have your camera on, which I think everyone but Tanner does. So Tanner, if you can put yours on so I can give you the CE credit, would be awesome. Anyway, I guess we ready to roll?
This is ready as the ethics.
Okay. Were you in my class yesterday? What? Did you just get back or what?
Yeah. I was in Tennessee. We had a layover for 12 hours.
Did you really? In Tennessee?
Well, no, in Texas.
Oh, in Texas.
It's ridiculous.
Huh.
Yeah, American Airlines stuff over there. They are.
Well, did you have a good time?
I had a good time though, but
That's
before
good.
that, it's good.
That's okay, so here we go. So here's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna go through and let me make this a little better for you guys here in the room.
Actually, I was on your base camp yesterday. Yeah, I was on that.
Oh, that's what I was.
Both of you guys are. Everybody's talking. Everybody's.
Was it hard to hear?
It was a little noisy here.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so the idea of what we're gonna do today is go through and talk about this. So one of the things, and I said this to you guys in the buyer packet class, but I'm gonna say it for the REPC as well, is kind of think of it this way. If you have never stopped and read the entire contract, you need to do that. Like, this is, for me, I feel like, and this is maybe gonna sound bad, and I don't necessarily mean it to sound bad, but it might sound bad. I kind of feel like because of how easy it is for us to get a real estate license, and we are professionals, the same as you would look at a doctor, a dentist, a CPA, an attorney, like we're professionals. And because of that, I feel like we need to know our contract. Like this, the real estate purchase contract, we should know it. And I'm speaking to myself here too. I should know it better than I know it, because this is our tool of our trade and our profession. And so if you have never read through the contract completely, you should do that, because people pay us a lot of money to know this kind of stuff. And in fact, unfortunately, the way we are perceived in the community or public is you're there to open a door. Like, you get paid all that money to go open a door. And that's not true, and it shouldn't be true. And so part of where I feel like we create that value is us being able to know and understand the contract. And I'm amazed at how many people don't really understand it. So anyway, so we're gonna go through and talk about some stuff on there today to make sure that we at least cover some of that good stuff. All right, so first piece I wanna always point out is this is a legally binding contract. And Utah law requires real estate licensees to use this form. Buyers and sellers, however, may agree to alter or delete its provisions or use a different form. So the only key thing for you as agents, though, is that it needs to be one created by an attorney. If it's not, the real estate purchase contract is what you need to do, okay? So just keep in mind, this is a legally binding contract, and that's part of why I say you need to know it.
You said, okay, so I know people do it for self-owner, but by yourself, if you change anything, it has to be the lawyer.
Yeah, if you change, if you're gonna use a different contract, like if you were gonna create your own.
Like if I was doing a situation between me and like a buyer I had and a seller, they want to do something else.
Yeah, if they were saying, hey, we don't want to use this real estate purchase contract, I found one that I bought at Home Depot or not Home Depot, Office Depot, I guess. Something like that, or online, whatever. As long as it's created by an attorney, you're fine to do it. It's just you can't go create a separate purchase contract. Yes.
How do you get that?
How do you get
How
what?
do you pull up the contract? It's in Utah real estate, right?
Yep, so if you go to forms, and then I went to URE Legacy Forms Library,
Oh,
and I just
Always
typed
think it's the library, where's the library?
yeah, I saw
just look for the library.
URE.
The MLS forms kind of messed me up, but
Yeah, I feel like it did as well, I feel like, but anyway, okay, so, let's go through, what we're gonna do is basically go through and talk about the different sections. We're not gonna spend a whole lot of time on some sections, and others we're gonna spend a lot of time on, because those are the ones that I see that agents struggle with the most. And so the first one is this section on earnest money, and I don't know how much time Jason spent on Thursday with it, so we'll find out here in a second. I'm gonna ask you some questions and we'll see if he spent enough time on it or not. So, in terms of the earnest money, how long do we have to get the earnest money deposit? And for you guys on Zoom, feel free to unmute and answer.
do you want me to answer or no? That's the question.
I don't care, anybody can.
Get 4 calendar days.
Okay, so Aubrey's saying you have 4 calendar days. Is that correct?
No later than.
Okay, good. I like that. That becomes important as well. No later than 4 calendar days.
After acceptance.
After acceptance, good. Now because when you guys were in real estate school, what did they teach you? If you have money given to you, how long do you have to deposit it? What did you learn in school? Remember?
4 calendar days.
No,
It was 3 days.
3 days.
Yeah.
It says, well, I had
State law
classes
says
again.
3 days.
State law says
That was
3
the
days?
most
Okay, that's what I was
confusing part
gonna
of
ask you.
And it is so confusing because state law says you got 3 days.
Yeah, I was gonna
Our
ask you
contract
that,
says you got
state
4
law.
calendar days.
Yeah.
So which is it?
1 day.
1 day.
Well,
Yeah, that's a good policy,
Just
1
do 3
day.
days and then you're covered.
Yeah. So the reason that it's okay to do 4 days is because, so the idea of that 3 days is if there is not a separate agreement between the buyer and seller, then you have 3 days. But because in the real estate purchase contract here, it says that they will deliver it. So I want to clarify, because I still haven't said that Aubrey was right. Because the question I asked is, how long do you have to deposit the earnest money? He said 4 days.
Is that 4 calendar days, no later than 4.
Okay, he said no later than 4 calendar
After
days.
acceptance.
That is not correct.
Oh, man.
So what is it?
You have 3 days from no later than 4 days, whenever they give you the.
No.
I think it's just 3 days.
Carolyn
Well,
says it's
it
3.
says-
So this is why we're having this. Jason did not spend enough time on
Seller, the
it.
property described below and agrees to deliver no later than 4 days after acceptance, so the seller delivers the money.
Okay, good. So
No later than 4
let me,
days.
I'm gonna turn on this
And
camera.
then the brokerage shall have
Oh,
4
no, it doesn't
calendar days in which to deposit the earnest money into the brokerage real estate trust account. So the brokerage only has 4 days,
Okay,
so wouldn't it be conducive just to say 3 days so the brokerage has time to
okay, so think of it this way. We have, and 4 days, so can you guys see me okay on, you should be able to. We have 4 days, which is what Aubrey was saying, is we have no later than, or is that right, how it was worded? No later than?
No later than 4 calendar days.
No later than 4 calendar days to receive the earnest money. Once it's received, then we have 4 calendar days to get it deposited. So how many days do we have to get the earnest money deposited?
8.
Close, you're close. You're missing 2 words, I guess, or 1, depending on how you do it.
Well, 8 days
You
from
have
the time of
no later.
acceptance.
up to, or no later, but up to is how I would say it. You have up to 8 days to get the earnest money deposited. Because it's 4 days and 4 days. So what happens then if I get the earnest money, it's delivered, because remember, Aubrey already pointed out, it says no later than 4 days, so we have no later than 4 days. So what happens if I get it in 2 days?
Then you have enough.
You have 4 days to,
Then we have 4 days to get it deposited. So that's why think of it, that's why I like to do it this way with like 4 fingers on this hand and 4 on this hand. Because you have up to 4 here and up to 4 here. So if you get it in 1 here, now you have 4 here. So you got 5 days total in that case. So, but you have up to 8 days to do it. Now, but keep in mind, the reason we're having this conversation is because sometimes agents are like, oh, well, you have 8 days. And so if the client delivered it on day 1, the agent thinks, oh, well, now I've got 7 days to get it deposited, and that's not true. Once you have received the earnest money, you have 4 days to get it deposited.
well, I think I read somewhere it's two separate steps, so it's not
Correct.
really one step.
Correct. That's why I did it as 2 on 2 hands. This is step 1 is 4 days, step 2 is 4 days. If step 1 is done in 3 days, then you got 7 days. If it's 2 days, you got 6. If it's 1 day, you got 5. If it's
0 days.
0 days, I guess you missed your deadline, yeah.
Better call the seller.
Yeah. So good, okay, so on this earnest money section here, just keep that in mind as you have 4 days up to 4 days to get it, and then we after that have 4 days to get it deposited.
It
So,
used to be 3 days, has it
no,
always been 4? I don't know,
I've
it's
had
like
my license for 28 years now, and it's been,
3 and 3.
the state law has been 3 days all that
Okay,
time.
that's what it is, okay.
But because buyer and seller are agreeing to something different, then it's okay. And buyer and seller can agree to something different, that's okay. It's just, but if there was no agreement, so where maybe what you're thinking of is before we had this contract that we currently have, there was a section about additional earnest money that didn't specify a time frame. And so when that happened, you had 3 days to get it deposited, once that was given to you.
Yeah, because wasn't it underneath additional earnest money, wasn't there like a box or something?
Yeah,
Well,
Or
she
is
means
there still
before.
a
Yeah, there's still
yeah.
some stuff there, we'll get to that. in a
Oh.
second, but-
I see it now. I see what you're talking about. 4 color today at the very bottom, licenses.
Yep, so you have the 4 here, and then down here,
I thought that was the same thing over again, okay.
nope,
Brokers shall have 4 days in which to deposit, okay, that makes sense. I thought it was talking about the same thing, that makes.
nope,
okay.
so you have, that's why I like to do it on 2 different hands. 4 days to receive it, then 4 days to get it deposited, so yeah, cause this is saying after acceptance, then you have the 4 days for the brokerage to get it deposited. So now with that, just make sure when you receive the earnest money that, yes, once you receive it, we still have 4 days to get it deposited, but don't push that to the very last second. Like, there's a lot of times agents will show up here and be like, oh, I have until what time to get it deposited?
What time?
According to the contract, you have up until 5 o'clock, right? If you show up here at 4:59 to hand it to Brianna, it will not be deposited. You will not have met the deadline. So don't push it till the last second. And the reason that it's 4 days is to allow for holidays. So that when there's a holiday and the banks could potentially be closed for 3 days, it's Saturday, Sunday, Monday, gives you that 4th day. So anyway, so just kind of keep that in mind as you're doing the earnest money. So any questions on that section? All right, I'll take that as a no. Okay, under section 1, Jason probably spent a bunch of time on this, I'm hoping, but it just in terms of the included items, just keep in mind, I get asked probably a couple of times a month. Somebody will ask me, hey, is this, and I had it even actually this week, somebody asked me, hey, if blah, 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 is that gonna be included in the sale of the property? And just keep in mind, if it is attached, then it is included. Now, what about though, a TV that is mounted to the wall, but the TV is not mounted to the mount, it's just sitting on the mount?
TV's not included.
But what about the mount?
Not included.
Yes. So just kind of keep that in mind, because sometimes people will look at the TV and they'll see that there's brackets on the back and it's mounted. Now, if the TV is like somehow screwed to that mount, then yes, the TV would be a fixture now. But if it just has a slot that the TV is just setting on, meaning you could just go lift it up and it comes off, then that would not be considered to be included, okay?
If they leave the house though, and you close and settle, like technically, like, they can't get the TV back, right?
Yeah, if they left it, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah, if they left it, then,
My TV,
yeah, I mean, well, they could probably come back and say, hey, we left that behind, we need to get it, but,
call the cops.
yeah, call the
If it's not in the
police.
contract in some way, then
Yeah, so just notice that on here, in the contract here in section 1, it says all installed TV mounting brackets. And the reason it has it worded that way is because most of the time the TV just slides into it's got a slot there that it just slides into, so TV would not be included. All right, so like I say, some of this stuff, I'm gonna assume that Jason's gone through but if you have questions on certain things you wanna talk about, I'm assuming he went through the other included items and excluded items and water service and the purchase price, all that kind of stuff.
You spent a good amount of time on all this, Russ, really well.
Okay, good.
So super silly question here.
Yeah.
If you're selling a home and the seller has a garden, they're entitled to whatever comes from their garden for the season, right? For the harvest. Is that true?
I don't remember actually.
That was something
yeah,
from
they're
the
entitled to what comes from the
classes.
garden,
It's
the
the,
harvest, yeah,
Oh, okay,
they
there you
kind
go,
of
then
went over
yes.
that a lot.
okay,
They're entitled to the vegetables?
yeah, whatever they're growing.
I've never actually seen that really come into play in my career. I'm not saying
No,
it couldn't or
worry about it.
wouldn't, but yeah. So that is a good point, so thank you. Okay, so section 3, settlement. So this part, I just always want to make sure that everybody understands the difference between settlement and closing, because we, as real estate agents, myself included, constantly talk about, we are constantly talking about, oh, I got a closing on Friday. When we actually probably don't have a closing on Friday, we have a settlement on Friday. So just to go through this to remind you, so settlement has to take place no later than the settlement deadline referenced in 24D, okay? Or otherwise mutually agreed by the buyer and seller. And in order for settlement, so let's define, this is now going to give you the definition of settlement. Settlement is A, when the buyer and seller have signed and delivered to each other or to the escrow closing office all the required documents by the REPC, by the lender, by title insurance and escrow offices, and written instructions, including if it was a split closing, okay? So that, the first thing that has to happen for settlement to occur, and I'll explain why this is important in a second, so make sure you're listening on this, because again, back to my opinion is, as realtors, agents, we should know this kind of stuff because this is like our tool, okay? So in order for settlement to occur, the buyer and seller have to have signed and delivered to each other all the documents required, either by the REPC, title, lender, all that kind of stuff, okay? First, then second, they have to have delivered any monies required to be paid by the buyer under the documents, except, and the key word being, sorry, I know my highlight's going all over the place, but except any proceeds for the loan. So any monies that are gonna be transferred between the buyer and the seller have to be delivered with the exception of their loan, okay? And that has to be given to either the other party or the escrow or closing office, and it has to be in the form of cash, wire transfer, cashier's check, or other form acceptable to the escrow closing office. So what has to happen for settlement to have occurred?
Signatures captured,
Signatures and
buyer and sellers exchanging funds.
the money being exchanged with the exception of the loan only. So keep that in mind. It's, because sometimes I will hear people talk about, oh, we went to settlement and the seller didn't or the buyer didn't, and we fulfilled our part of the obligation. Well, the question always is, did you go sign all the documents required and deliver the funds if there were some that needed to be delivered in the form of cash, wire transfer, cashier's check, or other form, okay? So that's settlement. Closing then is going to be after settlement has been completed is the first one. So for closing to take place, settlement has to have happened. The proceeds from the loan delivered by the lender to the escrow office and the applicable closing documents recorded in the office of the county recorder. And this is the key piece. All of three of those things have to happen within 4 calendar days after settlement. Okay, so once you go to settlement, which we remember what settlement is, the signing and exchanging the money, you have 4 calendar days after that for closing to take place. So what happens then if we went and did settlement and then for whatever reason, the funds didn't show up on time within that 4 calendar days?
We send them an addendum, say extend our stuff.
Good, you would need to do an addendum to extend that, and do it before 5 o'clock, 4 days later.
Are you talking about just this last part? Like the lender didn't get the money to the escrow office?
Yep, if for some reason the money wasn't there, like, they were like, oh, the underwriter needs
Well, you
another
would hope
document.
somebody would
before
let
we-
you know that.
Yeah, I would hope so, and that's the key thing, is just
Because you're not
communicate.
gonna know that.
Well, you
So-
probably will, because you'll be like, hey, when am I getting my check? And the title company will say, we
Well,
haven't
the
gotten it from the lender yet.
Seller will be wondering where their check.
Correct, all of
Yeah.
those things. Okay, so that's what happens for closing, and just keep in mind, closing is those 4 things. Settlement's already been done, the new loan's delivered, and it's been recorded. Did I say 4 things? I meant 3. Is all the documents recorded, and all of that has to happen within 4 calendar days of settlement. So just think that through when you are putting your settlement deadline. Pay attention to what are the 4 days after. So for me, and Jason probably talked about this, but just in case he didn't, for me, I like to always do my settlements on like a Monday or a Tuesday. Because then you have the whole rest of the week for the banks and stuff to work, versus if you did it on Thursday and it doesn't fund and record on Friday, now you've got, it didn't happen Friday, now you got Saturday, Sunday, it has to happen Monday. You're giving,
But if
they're
Monday's
2 of the
a
days.
holiday, then
Yeah, and
you're-
if Monday's a holiday, you're toast. So just look at the calendar when you're scheduling out your settlement deadlines. And I typically, again, just my preference is I like to do them on a Monday or a Tuesday, because then you've got the whole rest of the week for them to get everything taking place. The other thing I've found by doing it on a Monday or a Tuesday is a lot of times that will mean the seller has to be out like Wednesday or Thursday. They're typically gonna move out the week before, which makes things so much easier if you're representing the buyer.
Since your buyer usually can move in over that next weekend.
Correct. Okay, the next section is talking about possession, so we'll have a discussion on that real quick, and then we'll pick up our pace again. But except as provided in section 6.1 A and B, which, so if we go down to 6.1 A and B, that is gonna be if the property's rented out, okay? So it's saying, except as provided in those sections, they'll deliver physical possession to the buyer either upon recording, so many hours after recording, or 1 day after recording. So, or however many days after recording, you're gonna just decide on that. But let's talk about what happens, cause I get this call all the time. Hey, my buyer just showed up to the property and we were supposed to get possession at whatever, let's just say 11 o'clock today. It's now 11:30. So we were supposed to get possession at 11 o'clock and we just got there and they're still moving out.
Call cops.
Yeah, well, that's what people think is like, typically the buyers are like, well, let's call the police because they're now in my property. What's gonna happen if you call the police?
They won't do
3 days.
anything. Yeah,
Yeah, they're gonna show up to keep the peace, but
they're not gonna.
There's nothing they can
They'll
do.
be mad because it's a waste of their time.
Yeah, it's a waste of their time, basically. No, they're happy to show up and keep the peace, just to make sure, but ultimately, really, if that happens, just go talk to the seller and or the listing agent and just, hey, like, what's the plan? Like, how, we were supposed to get possession at 11, it's now 11:30, doesn't even look like you guys are close to being out, like, what's the plan?
Pay a day or two rent.
Yeah, I mean, you could try to get some rent from them, but just kind of
We
know
should talk it
that
out.
it's not like, what the buyers want is to be able to call the police and have them arrested, I guess, but that's not gonna happen. And yes, it stinks, like it's crappy, because your buyer's there with their moving truck and they're ready to move in. But if the seller's not out, like, there's not a whole lot you can do. So the best thing is just try to work something out. Figure out a way, and I don't like even the idea I'm about to say. It's not a preference for me, but, work something out of, like, have your buyer put their stuff in, get the seller to get the garage empty or the basement empty and have your buyer put their stuff there. Or, I mean, best is just, can they just wait, and give them some time. But if not, like, you just gotta work something out.
So I've experienced this like a lot more than I'd like to, especially even on the seller side. I think it's more stressful being a seller's agent and having your sellers take.
Well, yeah, because the buyer's agent's calling you going, hey.
Yeah, so it's like everybody hates you. But I think, would you say, would there be some kind of like, I don't know, way you can communicate with both parties and say, hey, talk to the agents, hey, can you answer your buyers? If they wait a day, we'll buy them lunch. I know you guys
Yeah.
suggested that. I'll buy you lunch. That way they kind of see that, hey, we hear you. Let's work on it.
Yep.
And then like, what would you suggest to help your sellers or buyers be more prepared, not aggressive?
Yeah, so that's a good point. I think the biggest thing is when you are negotiating this contract with your seller, and so hopefully you guys heard his question, basically is how do you help on the seller side? So really the best thing is when you're negotiating the contract, explaining to the seller, like, okay, we're gonna go sign, settlement is whatever day. You will probably have 24 hours, one day after, or, once it records to be moved out of the property. And just really explaining to them, hey, if you don't, like, you're in default. And they could, and we'll get to section 16, but they could choose one of the options from section 16 because you're now in default on the contract. So really, it's just mostly really helping them to understand a couple things. One is they need to be out. Two, that the property has to be broom clean and free of debris and personal belongings. So if there's stuff you don't want, you don't get to just leave it behind. Including, I've seen where people leave like, oh, we left the paint behind that matches the walls of, and yes, the buyer probably would want it and ask and make sure, but technically, you don't leave it behind if you haven't asked, like, don't leave it. So really, you just need to have that conversation to explaining to the seller. Now, are there gonna be things that come up of, yeah, we had the movers scheduled and their truck broke down, and that's the hard part, and so that's why we get the big bucks, is because we get to deal with all that kind of
Well,
stuff.
isn't there, I've always just set the expectation, you need to be out before
Yeah.
settlement.
Yep.
And then that way you don't run into the,
Yep.
you have 24 hours to get your stuff out.
Yeah, which is a balancing act though,
Yeah.
because if you get them to get out, if on the seller side, you get them out before settlement and then the deal falls apart, now your seller's mad because they moved out. So it is this balancing act. So here's what I would say is, to some extent, it's almost, and this depends on which side of the table you're sitting on. When you're representing if I'm representing the buyer, I'm usually doing 1 day on here or even upon recording because I want them to feel like they have to be out. But if I'm on the seller side, it's not a bad idea to, on your possession, maybe put 7 days. Maybe negotiate a and even to some extent on the buyer side, maybe having that a little bit more of a window of, hey, they're gonna get 7 days, like, or, you know, at least 3 days or something. Because then you can make sure your buyer understands, but you gotta make sure your buyer understands. After you go sign and it records, you're not getting possession for 3 days, so, cause you'll have them be like, all right, so when do we get the keys? And part of that to keep in mind is if you're representing a buyer and they're coming from another state, in some states, when they go sign, the money changes hands, it records, and they get the keys right then. So if they're coming from another state, they may be expecting that, so you gotta make sure you're communicating to them, helping them understand that that's not how it happens necessarily in Utah. So if they're coming from out of state, and or it's their first time buying or
They
something.
pull up to settlement in the moving truck.
Yeah, oh, I've seen it before many
Really?
times. Hey, the moving truck's out there, give us the keys, we're gonna go unload right now. So, all right, any questions on possession? All right, next section goes through and talks about the prorations, and so the seller's gonna be responsible up until recording. The buyer will take over after that. Yeah, it's section 4. Okay, I'm gonna skip over some of this unless you have questions. Hopefully confirmation of agency makes sense. Title insurance to the property. So on this, just keep in mind, we already kind of referenced up here in section 3 about the possession down here, that in section 6, the seller is representing to the buyer that they have actually fee title that they can convey to them. It does say here that it'll be done by a general warranty deed. Okay, so just kind of as an FYI on that. And then it is also gonna be subject to any long-term leases or short-term rental bookings that are already happening on the property. But, so the buyer's agreeing to accept any of those. So in fact, I got an email this week on Tuesday, I think it was. I got an email from a tenant that one of our agents listed a property for sale this week, or maybe it's been a week or so, but anyway, listed the property recently. The tenant sent me an email with a copy of their lease agreement saying, I have a 10-year lease, which I'm like, who does a 10-year lease on a house? Like the rent was set for 10 years. I'm like, I wouldn't.
Oh, really?
Anyway.
Where was this at?
Yeah, I know, I'm like, geez. And so the tenant obviously was freaking out saying, you have to take the home off the market because I have an interest in this property. And so I wrote back and said, you don't have to worry about your lease. Your lease will still be good and it's still gonna be honored. So kind of keep that in mind. A seller buying a property that has tenants in it, has to honor that lease. The lease,
They have to accept the rent for that.
they gotta accept whatever the rent is, and so part of their
Maybe he was
due.
worried his rent was gonna go up.
Well, I think she was worried that the new owner was gonna show up and say, get out, and
Yeah.
I just reassured her that that's not gonna happen. They can't do that, they are taking the property. And I reassured her, like, you can sell property that's leased, like, think about somebody buying an apartment building, could you imagine? Hey, we're buying this apartment building, everybody's gotta get out. Yeah, no, that would never fly. So anyway, so they are taking the property subject to any long-term leases or short-term rental bookings that are in place. That they will buy,
Sorry. I've seen like some people write up a contract saying, hey, I just read an article, actually, it was in California, they did a 30-year lease for their clients. Is that legal?
Yeah.
Like, how can they do that?
Well-
It's almost like, if I'm buying it for myself though, like, can I kick them out and say, this is my personal property? Like, can they just stay there, I guess, or how does that work?
So if you are buying it as your personal property, no, so let me specify it, I am not an attorney, so, yeah, exactly. So I actually think that to some extent, this lady doing the 10-year lease and probably this 31 that you're talking about, to some extent, I think they may be trying to work the system a little bit. because of the fact that, they're thinking, well, yeah, if somebody buys the house, or if it forecloses, or in the case of this one is somebody who's filing bankruptcy it's a bankruptcy thing. So, I mean, the courts could come in and do something about it, but as far as you as just a person, if you were buying a house and there was a lease in place for 30 years at a set rate,
I think I would look for a different
yeah,
house.
well, you gotta check it out during your due diligence and
Yeah.
know that you're buying the property subject to those leases. So,
That's the same with short-term rentals.
yep, same with the
That's
short
all
term.
being
And so, yeah, during the short term rentals, we'll see here in section 7 though, that, they have to give a copy of the lease and short-term rentals to the seller, so. And then any new short-term rentals going forward would have to be agreed to by the new buyer, so. Okay, but yeah, please stop if you have questions, that's great. Section 7 goes through and talks about seller disclosure, so let me make sure on this, because we screw up, and when I say we, I'm throwing myself into the mix. I still sometimes forget this, so if I'm assuming that some of you do as well, or will as well, so let's talk about it. Seller disclosures, no later than the seller disclosure deadline in 24A, the seller shall provide to the buyer the following documents, and here's the key piece, in hard copy or electronic format, which are collectively referred to as seller disclosure. So sometimes what I see people do, agents do, is sends to the buyer, hey, here's a link to the documents. You can click on the link. But what does this say?
Hard copy or electronic format,
So-
means they have to get it and be able to read it.
Yeah, so electronic format, I would, again, I'm not an attorney or a judge, but I would interpret that as a PDF, not a, here's a link that you can go find them yourself. Now, you could maybe argue that as long as they click, like if you put it into a Google Drive and then sent them the link to the Google Drive and they clicked on it and boom, there it is, that probably would count. But I would say to you, just to be safe, so that there's no question, make sure that you're delivering to them either hard copy or a PDF of it, not just a link to something. Or do an addendum that says that it'll be a link to somewhere, okay? But the next piece is you have to deliver to them by that seller disclosure deadline, A through L here. So all of this stuff, and many, many times agents send over just the seller property condition disclosures and they feel like they've met their seller disclosure deadline. But you have not, because if the property was built prior to 78, you gotta give them the lead-based paint disclosure. You gotta give them a copy of the commitment for title insurance. Any CC&Rs or rules and regulations affecting the property, the most recent minutes, budget, and financial statements, long-term leases, short-term leases, existing property management agreements, evidence of water rights or water shares, notice of any claims or conditions known to the seller, and then in general, the sale or disposition of a U.S. property by a foreign person you'd have to disclose. So all of that stuff has to be given. Now, there was a time where there were people going out and writing offers, putting a really short seller disclosure deadline and really large earnest money deposit, and then getting the sellers to accept it. The agent then typically wouldn't send over all of these things listed here. And at day after the seller disclosure deadline, this buyer could say, okay, I'm gonna cancel the contract, and not only do I want my earnest money back, you now owe me an amount equal to that because you didn't meet your deadline.
That's terrifying.
So just kind of keep that in mind. Two things. One, don't have your seller disclosure deadline be too short. Like for me, when I'm representing a buyer, I put 3 days. Probably is a good idea to maybe get 7. You know, if you're on the seller side, counter that back and get 7 days. Because you want to make sure you have enough time to send all this stuff over. So if you have it all already, which hopefully as a good listing agent, you've done that, then a short 3-day seller disclosure deadline would be just fine because you've already got it and you can send it over to them. But just make sure you remember, it's not just the seller disclosures, it's all of these things listed here, okay? All right, due diligence, on this section is the buyer either is or is not, and just keep in mind that the buyer could cancel for any reason. And the buyer could cancel for no reason. So it doesn't have to be a reason. And my recommendation is to you, if you are canceling based on section 8.1, don't tell the other side why. Just say, we are canceling based on section 8.1. And if they say, why? Just say, because we have the right to in section 8.1. Yeah, but what's the reason you're canceling? Because section 8.1 gives us the option to do that, is why we're doing it. And I would maybe point out to them that it could be for any reason or no reason. So it doesn't really matter. We just have the right to cancel. Now, the reason I say that is just because if somebody's happened to say, well, because we couldn't get the loan, then, they could maybe, really, section 8.1 would still give you that right. Because it could be for any reason.
Has that always been that way?
Yeah.
8.1?
Yep,
It's been 5 years, I can't remember.
you're good. Yeah, no, it's been that way for pretty much my whole career, as far as I remember.
I had buyers that we did cancel on this, but.
Yeah, and you can tell people, but I'm just saying you don't have to, and there are times when maybe you shouldn't, which we'll talk about next in the appraisal condition, right, Aubrey?
Well,
Yes.
we had this house in Tooele that we canceled on, and it was obvious after the inspection that, hello, the roof had asbestos in it.
Yeah,
But they knew, they had to.
yeah. So, okay, appraisal condition. Either is or is not. Now, the difference between appraisal canceling and the due diligence, the appraisal conditioning, here's what it says. If after the completion of an appraisal by a licensed appraiser, the buyer receives written notice from the lender or the appraiser that the property is appraised for less than the purchase price, and we're going to call that the notice of appraised value, buyer may cancel the REPC by providing written notice to the seller, and then notice here, with a copy of the notice of appraised value, which what was the notice of appraised value?
That's what they should have got from the appraiser and the lender, right?
Yeah, written notice from either the lender or the appraiser. Then no later than the financing and appraisal deadline referenced in 24C, they get the earnest money back without any written authorization from the seller. So, my recommendation for you is don't send the appraisal. And why should we not send the appraisal, Aubrey? Why would you recommend not sending the appraisal?
Because you're going to an ethics hearing. No, wait, so I'm confused too, actually, so.
So you're talking about the actual appraisal,
Like the report you get.
but I'm a little confused too. So you get two different things, you get an appraisal and a reason why the bank won't lend the money?
Nope, so if you're gonna cancel based on the appraisal, so if after the completion of appraisal by a licensed appraiser, the buyer receives written notice from the lender or the appraiser. So let's define could be written notice. So the appraisal could be written notice. What else could be written notice?
We're canceling. With the cancellation based on appraisal form?
No, you gotta get it from the lender or the appraiser.
Okay.
So what else would be written notice from the lender or the appraisal?
Loan rejection?
Okay, it could be loan rejection, possibly, but then I would say that you're canceling based on financing, not. So it doesn't have to be anything, it could be an email from the lender saying the property didn't appraise.
Okay.
But you don't send the appraisal.
I would not recommend sending the appraisal.
I didn't see that or in there. They should make that big and bold.
Right here, this or.
Yeah, why is it so small? Because I always read this, and I read it a few times actually, and I was like, the appraiser.
Written notice from the lender or the appraiser of that property.
Yep. Words matter.
This buyer may cancel LLC, providing written notice to the seller with a copy of the notice.
And the notice of appraised value is just something in writing from either the lender or the appraiser.
Okay, so that's not the appraisal
So that's what
Well, it could be the appraisal,
But you don't wanna send it.
but I'm recommending you don't send it as send the appraisal. And for two reasons. One is the buyer paid for the appraisal, it's theirs. Like, so why give it to the seller? The second is now they're gonna go through it and start questioning
Yeah.
things. And so Aubrey had one that he canceled based on this. His was a little different because the earnest money was non-refundable with the exception of if it didn't appraise for value. And so he sent over the appraisal, and so then their agent was basically trying to say, it appraised, he has the value, it says it appraised for that value.
So he was disputing.
The problem was, he said that, but said they're based on getting a structural engineer to sign off on the foundation, and the structural engineer said it should be fixed, doesn't have to be right now, but it should be. Well, the underwriter is saying, we want it fixed. And they wouldn't do it, didn't do it, I don't know. It's
That
just,
doesn't mean
I'm
it
still
has to be-
confused why they didn't do it.
I don't care.
Well, they
but-
still had the buyer could still cancel though, because the lender wasn't gonna land with
Correct.
that condition.
You got it.
Yeah,
But with that would be
but
a
that
financing
just
thing.
raises all the questions, I guess,
And the
huh?
earnest money would go differently if they canceled because. they
But
could
that
put
was
the
the
loan,
argument
right?
that they're having is that it did appraise for value. But our argument is, no, it didn't, because,
The
you didn't-
condition that it is in right now,
yeah, the condition it was in right then, according to, so anyway.
well,
It
it's
was-
just better not to send the appraisal, that would be one.
Yeah.
If he would have just sent over saying, hey, it failed to appraise unless you get these things done, there probably would, well, who knows, he would have called Max.
He probably would've called the appraiser and
Well, what if, do they know? They don't disclose who's appraiser info, do they?
he found out somehow.
He knew it all.
Really?
So
No.
anyway, long story is he
Lost.
he sent to me saying, if you don't give my seller the earnest money, I'm filing an ethics complaint against Aubrey. And, which I'm gonna be interested when I go to the next hearing to find out the details on,
Oh, is
if
it
I can
still
find
in
out.
motion?
no. We went, so he and I went to a hearing 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And last Tuesday, we got the notice that he was not in violation of the code of ethics.
It would seem that he was, but.
Well, there was one thing that they could have said.
Oh.
But thankfully, they,
I'm gonna get my broker's license in a couple years, so.
you'll be good. Anyway, so my recommendation is, don't send the appraisal, just send something from the lender saying it didn't appraise.
Well,
'Cause
then I have a question, because for FHA loans, doesn't the appraised value
would stick.
fall?
Yep.
But they don't do that with the actual appraisal, they just do it with the value from the
Well,
appraisal?
so the answer on that is it depends. And, cause just because
Well, I
they've
don't
done the
know.
appraisal, the lender, only if they actually file it with FHA does that appraisal stick. Sometimes
Oh.
if it doesn't appraise, they just don't file it and then it doesn't.
So it's a matter of filing it and they do
Yeah.
that value.
Which I think they're supposed to do,
Yeah,
I just-
that's
they-
my understanding.
I just don't know.
They
Well,
do.
let me rephrase that. I know there are times when it doesn't happen and I don't know why. That I don't know why, but there are times. Okay, so that's the appraisal. Financing condition is on that one. If it is conditioned upon getting financing, then you can again on this, you can just send over saying, we're not satisfied with the terms of our financing, we're canceling. Now, here's the key thing though, and Jason probably went through this, but it's worth highlighting again. This section right here, buyer's right to cancel before the financing and appraisal deadline. So if the buyer cancels, and again, on their sole discretion, so meaning any reason at all, their sole discretion, if they're not satisfied with the terms and conditions of the loan, they can cancel. But if they cancel after due diligence, but before the finance and appraisal deadline, they will lose however much money of their earnest money is put in here. So if you're on the buyer side, what do you wanna put in there? Zero. If I'm on the seller side, what do I want in there?
The whole thing.
The whole thing. So typically though, I would say there should be some skin in the game. So you probably ought to have some here, but if I'm representing a buyer, I'm gonna put zero pretty much every time in there. Now, during like COVID, when you were getting 50 offers, then you might be putting the whole earnest money in there, but as a
Depends on the market.
yeah, it depends on the market, but as a general rule for me, most of the time, I'm gonna probably put 0 there and hope that the listing agent doesn't counter. If they don't, then in essence, if 0, so think of it this way. If 0 is in here, your buyer has 2 due diligence deadlines, in essence. Meaning, their due diligence deadline really goes up until the finance and appraisal deadline, because if you put 0 in there, they don't lose any of their earnest money. So they can cancel for any reason, they can just say, we don't like the loan. And
That's all they would have to say in notice to the seller.
And that's all you should say. Don't say
They
anything
don't need to know
else. Just,
anything else.
they're canceling based on section 8.3BI. That's all you need to say.
I don't.
Hey, Russ,
Yes.
I just had a quick question. So it seems like after 8.1, all these are just extra reasons that you could use to cancel. But even if it is because of appraisal or loan failure, can you just use 8.1 and not have to even go down these roads and just say we're canceling because we can?
Yes, that's exactly right. So if you are canceling for either appraisal or financing of the financing, and you are before your due diligence deadline, yeah, correct. Just cancel based on that, because that one gives your buyer the most latitude.
Okay.
Yep, excellent thought. Yep, even if it was based on financing, if you're still within your due diligence, just cancel on due diligence. That is the best way, because there's 0 argument for that one.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, good thought.
Russ,
Yes.
I wanted to add to that one of the great pieces of advice that I got from you and Jason was buyer and buyer's sole discretion, and using that clause in the or that phrase in the REPC for cancellation is what kept my buyer safe and got his earnest money back, because we ended up having to cancel based on a couple of different reasons, but we used the financing and buyer's sole discretion phrase for sorry, I'm trying to do 2 things at once. And we used that so that we could actually get out of the contract and get his earnest money back. So that phrase, buyer's sole discretion, is what worked with the other agent, because the other agent tried to challenge me and say, well, you need to provide proof from your lender that your buyer doesn't qualify for the loan. And I'm like, well, maybe it was that way back in the day, and I remember back then, but it's not that way now. And this clause exists, and thankfully for my buyer's benefit in this case. So I just wanted to share that wording, whatever you'd phrase is what I'm trying to say, is pretty invaluable.
Correct. Yep, because that's just it. It doesn't matter. They can say, well, do this or do that. Nope, it's in the buyer's sole discretion. So, cool, thank you. All right, section 8.4 is just the additional earnest money. I'm going to skip through some of these things. Let's go to this condition of the property. So in terms of for the buyer, so section 10.2 here is they're agreeing in terms of the physical condition that buyer is purchasing it as is. So sometimes you'll see people do an addendum that said the property is being sold as is. That's redundant, because it already is sold in as is condition. So just kind of keep that in mind, that the property is already being sold in as is condition. And so if you've got a seller saying that of, hey, we want to sell it as is, great, just show them right here in section 10.2, the property is in as is condition. So, okay. And then also for this, the buyer's acknowledging that they'll have their due diligence, that they can do it. And if based on their due diligence they proceed, that they're doing it on their own choice, basically, okay? So that's for the buyer. For the seller acknowledges that in reference to the physical condition, and they agree to disclose in writing to the buyer defects in the property known to the seller that materially affect the value of the property that cannot be discovered by a reasonable inspection by an ordinary prudent buyer. So if there's a hole in the wall, and it's obvious that there's a hole in the wall, the seller does not need to disclose that. They only have to disclose things that are that would materially affect the value of the property and cannot be discovered by a reasonable inspection by an ordinary prudent buyer. Now, the question is, what defines an ordinary prudent buyer? So when in doubt, disclose. Like, error on the side of too much disclosure, don't err on the side of why do, a inspector should be able to find that. They should find that. Don't rely on that. Go ahead.
You said this, I think, you or Jason said this, a year or so ago, that, there's an agent that says yes on all their,
It was actually an attorney friend of mine.
Oh, okay.
That he was selling his house and the buyer said they weren't gonna, so they made their offer and it was not they were, I don't know, they may have still had the due diligence, but they said they were not gonna hire a property inspector. And so for him, he then said, I redid my seller disclosures and I checked yes on pretty much every single thing. And then if you check yes, you've got to give an explanation. But so like, for example, I remember him saying, like, it had asked about problems with the stucco and he checked yes and said there's cracks in the stucco. And then, you know, are you aware of any issues with the roof? Yeah, it has some shingles that are looking worn. Like, he just puts everything on there. And the reasoning being, and this is what I do think you're getting to, and why I think you want to tell your seller is anything you disclose is going to make it to where the buyer can't really, I mean, I'm not saying they can't sue you, but the chances of them suing you and winning are dramatically less because if you put on there, you know, are you aware of any problems or leaks in the roof? Yep, we've had a few times where we had to get up and put tar on the roof. Well, then if all of a sudden there's a big problem and they go to court, a judge is going to look at it and go, well, did you check it out? And if they say no, the judge is going to be like, well, why would you not, like, buyer beware, caveat emptor, that you were told that there were problems, why wouldn't you check it out? So yeah, I feel like when I'm advising a seller of like anything you disclose, they can't come back on you. But from a seller standpoint, you feel like, well, I don't want my house to look bad. Hey, as long as you can explain what you've done with it to fix it, like the chances that they come back on you go down so much more, so yeah. Okay, so they agree to fill that out. B, to carefully review, complete, and provide the buyer a written, oh no, I already did that, right? Disclose in writing, to fill out the seller disclosures, and then deliver the property in substantially the same general condition as it was on the date of acceptance, as defined in section 23, ordinary warrantor accepted, and then last is delivery of the property in broom clean, so this is where I was talking to you before, always highlight this to your client. Has to be broom clean, and free of debris and personal belongings, and then also they have to repair any tenant or moving related damage. So I just think it's always a good idea to explain to your seller, hey, when you move out, this is what's gotta be done on the property. Am I blocking you? Do I keep
Yeah, that's fine.
in front of you? Sorry.
I can see it on both.
Okay. So that's that, pre-settlement walkthrough. This one's another important one to make sure we understand. So no earlier than 7 calendar days prior to settlement and upon reasonable notice and at a reasonable time, the buyer can conduct a pre-settlement walkthrough. And the purpose though is to determine only that it's in as represented, meaning that the items referenced in 1.2 and section 8.1B2 are respectively present, repaired, or corrected. So the purpose of the walkthrough is to make sure that everything that was supposed to be left with the property is left with the property, and any repairs that were done have been completed. But the failure to do the walkthrough does not mean that they have waived their right to get the property on the date of possession with those items present. So just know, it's always a good idea to remind your buyer the purpose of the walkthrough is just to make sure that the property's in the same general condition. Everything that was supposed to be left behind is left behind, and any repairs that were supposed to be done are done, okay? And then changes during the transaction says no substantial alterations or improvements will be made without prior written consent of the buyer. They can't go get new liens or loans, stuff like that on the property. They can't enter into any new short or long-term leases, And they also can't do any new bookings without the buyer's permission. And let's see, authority of the signers just says they have the right to sign if it's in a corporation or a trust. That this is the complete contract along with any of the addendas. And mediation, you probably went through that. All right, the next piece we're gonna do that we wanna make sure we spend is default. So what happens if somebody defaults? Remember I said to you that at one point there was some people who were going around doing huge earnest monies and short seller disclosure deadline, hoping people would default. Well, if that happened, then if the seller defaulted, then you would come down here to that seller default section to see what happens. But if the buyer defaults, so let's go through the buyer one first, then we'll go to that seller one. So if the buyer defaults, then the seller can elect for one of the following items. So these are the three choices that a seller has if the buyer defaults on the contract. So if you didn't get the earnest money deposited in a time frame that you were supposed to, the seller could say, oh, buyer defaulted. Now, so what that says is the first option they have is cancel the REPC and retain the earnest money deposit or deposits as liquidated damages. So if the buyer defaults, the first option a seller has is just take the earnest money as liquidated damages. Now the key thing with that is, the key word there on liquidated damages, if they take the earnest money, they're done. They don't have other options. That was your liquidated damages for them defaulting. So when you're representing a seller and somebody shows up with $2,000 earnest money, just from the seller standpoint, know if they cancel and you take their earnest money, that's all you're getting. You don't get anything else. That's it. The other option they have is they could keep the earnest money, so maintain that in trust and then sue the buyer if they, oops, I'm going too far. Sue the buyer to specifically enforce the REPC. So here's the challenge with that. Let's say that the buyer was getting a loan and they all of a sudden can't get the loan. And the seller's like, well, I don't want the earnest money back. Let's leave it in trust and let's sue the buyer to force them to buy the house. Good luck. If they can't get a loan, I don't know how that's gonna happen. But just know that is one of the options, is they could keep the earnest money in trust and sue. That's what I should have told that lady when she asked, what'd you do with the earnest money?
Yeah, I was just thinking about
We're waiting, we're gonna sue the seller until this is over.
that.
If they don't, that's what I should have said. If they don't drop this, we're gonna sue the seller.
Yeah, I think that's probably what she was kind of going towards. I was like, is that what she's talking about maybe?
Yeah, I don't know.
Are you guys gonna see that?
So, or C, the third option that the seller has if the buyer defaults is we give the earnest money back and pursue other remedies available at law. So they can either take the earnest money and then it's over. They can't go after anything else. They could leave it in trust and try to go force the contract, or they could give the earnest money back. So that's the thing to keep in mind, is if the seller is saying, hey, I want more than $2,000 because of the damages, guess what? You have to give back the $2,000 to go after more than $2,000. So just kind of keep that in mind. So that's another thing when we're negotiating of like, hey, if you're representing the seller, you might want to say, let's get enough earnest money that if they default, we're good. So anyway, all right, if the seller defaults, so they have three options as well. If the seller defaults, the buyer can cancel the REPC and in addition to the return of their earnest money, get an amount equal to that from the seller. So sometimes people will say, you get double earnest money. Well, that's not true. They don't get double earnest money. They get to, if the seller defaults, the buyer gets their money back and then they get an amount equal to it. So it's not like they doubled their money. I mean, they did, I guess, but they get their money back and an amount equal to that, okay? So that's the first option that the buyer has if the seller defaults is, and so keep in mind, like a lot of times when somebody calls me and it's like, hey, the buyer's defaulted, what does my seller do? Well, you go to the seller and say, here's your three options. So if the seller defaults, it's the same for the buyer. Here's your three options. Take your earnest money back in an amount equal to it, which again, is liquidated damages. So if they accept an amount equal to their earnest money, they're done. That's it. That's all they get. Or they could do the same thing as far as maintaining the earnest money and try to enforce the contract. That's more likely that a buyer could force the seller into that taking place, because very likely, meaning it's not like on the buyer side, if they couldn't qualify for the loan and they don't have cash, good luck forcing them to buy the property. But on the seller side, if they defaulted, the buyer could say, no, we want to go to court and force them to sell. So they could do that. Or the third option is they accept the return of the earnest money deposit and pursue other remedies available at law. So, but again, if the buyer accepts liquidated damages, seller agrees to pay it upon demand. So already if the buyer chooses, hey, I want an amount equal to it, the seller's already agreed to it. So really, it's a matter of, at that point, you go to court and have a judge put a judgment saying, yep, you owe them money. All right, so that's what happens if somebody defaults. The other thing actually to let me bring up on this that sometimes comes up is there's something in law that's called the first breach rule that basically says once one party breaches on the contract, the other party can't be expected to honor their side of the contract. So just kind of know, once one party has breached, the other party can't be held to their side of the contract as well, okay? But just also, these are your options, okay? Section 17 just goes through and says that if you do end up in court, the prevailing party is entitled to reasonable attorney's fees. This section, where I want to make sure you understand that any notices given have to be, with the exception of section 23, which we'll get to in a minute, have to be in writing. So that's the first thing. Any notice has to be in writing, signed by the buyer or seller giving the notice, and received by the buyer, seller, their agent, or the brokerage firm representing the buyer or seller no later than the deadline referenced. So any notices, with the exception of 23, which we'll get to here in a minute, have to be in writing, signed by the buyer or the seller, and received, which you're going to see in section 23, that's not the case. Okay? Section 19 here says that there will be no assignment unless the buyer and seller agree to it separately. The only exception to that would be they could transfer the property into or out of a trust, which would be, or a family partnership, a limited liability company, any of that kind of stuff. Those would be permissible transfers, but the buyer can't just go all of a sudden transfer the property to, or assign it to someone else without the seller's permission. Okay? Risk of loss is basically all on the seller until closing. At closing, then the buyer's now responsible for that. And the one thing that it does point out in here is if for some reason there was some damage done to the property that exceeded 10% of the purchase price, the seller could cancel. So that's really the only way a seller could cancel, is go do 10% of the purchase price in damage to your property. So if it's $1 million house, go do $100,000 worth of damage that you'll have to fix, and then you can cancel the contract. But that's the only out that a seller would have. So any damage is done is the seller's responsibility. All right, time is of the essence. All the deadlines are 5 p.m. I hate it when my phone rings at 4:55 every day, because I'm always like, crap, if this is somebody saying I need help and our deadline's in 5 minutes, it's probably too late. So anyway, so it's always 5 p.m. unless otherwise stated, and the term days and calendar days mean calendar days unless it specifies differently, okay? All right, section 23, we're almost done here. Section 23, acceptance occurs only when all of the following have happened. So when these things have happened, then is when settlement has occurred, or acceptance has occurred. The seller or the buyer has signed the offer or counteroffer to indicate acceptance. So that's first things. Seller or buyer has to sign either the offer or the counteroffer, indicating that they've accepted, and, so keyword again, and the seller or the buyer or their agent has communicated to the other party or the other party's agent that it has been signed as required. So remember, on notices has to be in writing, signed by the buyer or seller, and received. Acceptance only has to be signed and communicated. So just keep in mind, that's the difference. Once it's signed and communicated, it's done. So there have been times where an agent has said, so in fact, I got a call within the last month from an agent upset because here's what happened. They had sent over an offer, they represented the buyer, sent the offer, the listing agent got it, said, hey, we're not willing to do that. This is what we're willing to do. If you'll change da-da-da-da-da-da and get that sent over, we'll sign it. So the agent said, okay. They went and made all those changes. They sent the offer over, and then they never heard back from the listing agent. So they called the listing agent and said, hey, we haven't heard back from you. Have you guys signed it? And she said, oh, we went with another offer. So our agent called me upset, being, hey, we did exactly what they told us to do. And my answer was, well, let's take a look at section 23 of acceptance. And by the way, I'm like, it is crappy that happened, because that is pretty bad. But
Happened to me too.
acceptance only occurs when all of the following have occurred. And I said, so did the seller or buyer sign the offer that you sent over to indicate they accepted it? Well, no. Did they communicate that the other party has signed it? Well, no, but they said they would. And I'm like, I get it. It's crappy that happened. But unfortunately, there's nothing you can do about it because it had to be signed and communicated, and it didn't meet the threshold there. So just kind of keep that in mind of, there are going to be times when you're wanting to cancel and maybe you've already sent it over, like immediately send a text, make a phone call. Hey, we're withdrawing our offer or our counter offer. Ideal is to get it signed and all that. Sometimes people will try to make that argument. Well, notices have to be signed or in writing, signed by the party and received. And so I've had people try to make the argument to me of, well, they didn't put it in writing and sign it. Well, if the contract hasn't been accepted yet, does that apply? No. So you can just say, hey, we're withdrawing. There is a form and you should use it. I want to be clear. But nothing wrong with a quick text though first saying, hey, we're withdrawing our counteroffer. And then I would recommend saying, I'm going to get it written up and I'll send it over, but this is notice that we are withdrawing. And because the contract isn't accepted, that notice section doesn't apply because it's not accepted yet. If it had been, then, if they call you first or text you first and say, we've accepted, it's been signed, then you're going to have to cancel on due diligence at that point.
So should you never talk on the phone to other agents because they're shady?
Well,
This happened to me a couple times when I was a newer brand new
Yeah.
agent, and they're like, oh, we'll accept it, just send it over. And I'm like, okay, we'll send it over. And then they're like, oh, we took somebody else.
Yeah, we
They
love
put
to-
an offer to do that. So.
well, it's a different offer instead. And it's like, yeah, but you said you were, yep, I know what we said. But all right, any other questions on that?
Yeah, definitely.
I just head out and signs, but thank you.
Okay, so for you guys on Zoom, if you did not put your name in the chat box, make sure you do that. And so next Tuesday's class, I'm gonna beg, plead, what do I gotta do to get all of you to be here in person?
What is next
Pizza?
Tuesday's class?
Okay,
On it, Russ.
cool.
So, but I'm really glad we could do it online, but I'll be back to normal next week.
Yeah, Tuesday, and the reason is Tuesday is a game. We're gonna play a game. The whole class is a game. And it doesn't really work if people are on Zoom, so.
Well, I don't want to miss a game anyway.
Yeah, so be here. There'll be fabulous prizes too. You won't get prizes if you're on Zoom. So if you can't be here, then, we'll figure it out. But if you can, anyway, be here, please be here, because it'll just makes it so much, you'll have more fun and the class will be better. So anyway, okay. Thanks for being here. See you guys.
Thank you.